Imagine sitting across from someone who just told you the world is changing in ways darker than you thought possible. That's what happened when Megyn Kelly shared a chilling prediction on her show of what's coming next. And I'll be honest, it wasn't just shocking. It was a wake-up call. Because if Charlie's tragic assassination taught us anything, it's that when powerful forces feel threatened, they don't play fair. And here's the thing, Megyn herself might be a target. So that's why today I want to walk you through what she revealed. Why it matters for all of us and why this moment is bigger than just politics. This is about the future of free voices and maybe even your future, too. I've had plenty of conversations about difficult topics over the years, but there was something different about this one. The usual back and forth, the friendly banter that normally starts these discussions, it just wasn't there. Instead, there was this heavy silence, this shared understanding that we were living through something unprecedented. When two people who've spent years analyzing and discussing current events can barely find words to begin, the ground has shifted beneath everyone's feet. Charlie Kirk's assassination didn't just take away a voice. It shattered something fundamental about how we thought these conversations could happen in America. For those of you who might not have followed Charlie closely, he was someone who spent over a decade going to college campuses where students had been taught to see conservative ideas as dangerous. He didn't hide behind security or avoid the tough questions. He walked right into those lions' dens week after week, year after year, believing that young people deserve to hear different perspectives. And here's what made Charlie so effective. He had this remarkable ability to connect with young people in ways that frankly surprised everyone, including his critics. While most of us were writing off entire generations as lost to radical ideologies, Charlie saw potential. He saw minds that could still be changed, hearts that could still be reached. The numbers don't lie. In the most recent election, the youth vote shifted by nearly 10 points toward conservative candidates. That kind of movement doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone like Charlie spent years building trust, answering questions, and treating young people with respect even when they disagreed with him. But that success, that ability to change minds and win hearts, that's exactly what made him dangerous to certain people. Not dangerous in the way they claimed with their accusations and smears, but dangerous to their control over the narrative, dangerous to their assumption that they own the future because they controlled the universities. And in that raw, uncertain atmosphere, Megyn dropped her prediction, one that cut straight to the heart of what happens next. I've known Megyn for years and I can tell you she's not someone who throws around dramatic predictions lightly. She's seen enough, reported on enough, experienced enough to know the difference between temporary political turbulence and something more fundamental. So when she looked at the aftermath of Charlie's death and said things weren't going to calm down, that we were actually at the beginning of something much darker, I listened. Her prediction wasn't just that the violence would continue. It was that it would escalate. That the forces that felt threatened by Charlie's success, by his ability to reach young people and change their minds, wouldn't be satisfied with silencing just him. They would see his death as proof that their tactics work, and they would apply those same tactics more broadly, more aggressively. Think about that for a moment. We're not talking about some abstract political theory here. We're talking about a pattern where people who effectively challenge certain narratives find themselves facing increasing pressure, increasing isolation, and now apparently increasing physical danger. Megyn wasn't speculating based on what she hoped or feared might happen. She was looking at what already is happening and drawing the logical conclusions. But here's the chilling part. What she said next made me stop cold because it wasn't just about politics. Megyn described the pressure campaigns she's experienced personally, not just criticism or disagreement, which every public figure expects, but coordinated efforts to isolate her, to cut her off from platforms, to make it financially and professionally costly for anyone to associate with her. And why? Because she had the audacity to ask questions about certain topics that were supposed to be off-limits. She spoke about people she's known for years, allies who had stood with her through previous controversies, who suddenly went quiet when the pressure got intense enough. Not because they disagreed with her positions, but because someone made it clear that continuing to support her would come at a cost they weren't willing to pay. Now, imagine being in her position. You've built a career on asking tough questions and speaking uncomfortable truths. You've weathered storms before and come out stronger. But suddenly you're watching someone like Charlie, someone who is doing essentially the same work you do, just focused on a younger audience, get gunned down for it. And you realize that all those pressure campaigns, all that coordinated effort to isolate and silence might have been leading to something much worse than professional consequences. That's when the prediction became personal for Megyn. She wasn't just analyzing what might happen to other people. She was recognizing that she might be next. And that raises the bigger question: why do these voices get targeted in the first place? The answer isn't complicated, but it is uncomfortable. Certain powerful groups have decided that some narratives are so important to their agenda that they cannot tolerate even good faith questions or alternative perspectives. It's not enough for them to present their side of the story and trust people to make informed decisions. They need complete control over what people are allowed to hear and think. Megyn experienced this firsthand when she made what should have been unremarkable observations that a certain conflict was becoming unpopular with American voters, that it might be time to reconsider the approach. These weren't radical statements. They weren't rooted in hatred or conspiracy theories. They were the kind of practical political observations that used to be considered normal commentary. But normal commentary became heresy when it challenged the approved narrative. Suddenly, someone who had spent years defending certain positions was being labeled with the worst possible terms simply for evolving her thinking based on new information and changing circumstances. The same thing happened to Charlie, just in a different context. He provided platforms for different viewpoints, hosted debates where both sides could present their cases, and allowed his own positions to evolve as he learned more. In previous eras, this would have been considered intellectual honesty and good journalism. Today, it's treated as betrayal worthy of the harshest consequences. This is what Megyn meant when she talked about narrative control. It's not enough for these groups to have their voices heard. They need to ensure that opposing voices aren't heard, or if they are heard, that there are severe consequences for listening to them. Think about how this works in practice. Someone like Charlie builds a following by being genuine, by admitting when he's wrong, by engaging with critics respectfully, and by treating complex issues with the nuance they deserve. He earns trust not by claiming to have all the answers, but by being willing to ask difficult questions and follow the evidence wherever it leads. But that kind of intellectual honesty is incredibly threatening to people whose power depends on others accepting simple narratives without question. When Charlie started asking uncomfortable questions about certain topics, when he gave platforms to people with different perspectives, when he refused to simply repeat approved talking points, that's when he became a target. And yet, despite that pressure, Megyn stood firm, which tells us something important about courage in dark times. I've always admired people who are willing to pay a personal cost for their principles. It's easy to have strong convictions when those convictions align with what's popular or profitable. It takes real character to maintain those convictions when doing so puts you at risk. Megyn could have taken the easy path. When the pressure campaign started, when former allies began distancing themselves, when the personal attacks intensified, she could have backed down, issued apologies, and returned to safer topics. Many people in her position have done exactly that. And honestly, who can blame them? The costs of resistance are real and they're severe. But she chose differently. She chose to continue asking the questions that needed to be asked, even knowing that each question painted a bigger target on her back. She chose to maintain relationships with people who were being systematically isolated, even knowing that this would make her isolation more complete. She chose to speak uncomfortable truths, even knowing that this would bring more uncomfortable consequences. This kind of courage isn't just admirable, it's historically essential. Every major positive change in human history has required people who are willing to stand up when it was dangerous to do so. Whether we're talking about ending slavery, securing women's suffrage, challenging totalitarian regimes, or simply maintaining basic human dignity in the face of overwhelming pressure to conform, it always comes down to individuals who decide that some things are worth the risk. What Megyn understood and what Charlie understood before her is that courage is contagious. When one person stands up, it makes it easier for others to stand up. When one person refuses to be silenced, it encourages others to find their own voices. When one person pays the price for speaking truth, it reminds others that truth is worth defending. But courage isn't just about speaking. It's also about preparing for what comes when you do. This brings us to one of the most surreal aspects of our current moment. Megyn described how people in media and commentary are now having to think about personal security in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. We're talking about journalists and commentators needing bulletproof vests, hiring security details, installing advanced alarm systems, not because they're investigating organized crime or reporting from war zones, but because they're expressing opinions that certain groups find unacceptable. Let me put this in perspective for you. Charlie Kirk was a young man who started a student organization and spent his time giving speeches at colleges. The most controversial thing he did was encourage young people to think for themselves and ask questions about what they were being taught. For this, he apparently needed to wear a bulletproof vest when he spoke publicly. And the results were remarkable. Megyn pointed out that Charlie's approach didn't just create passive viewers or casual supporters. It created young people who fundamentally changed how they saw themselves and their place in the world. She described seeing videos of young men who said that listening to Charlie inspired them to dress better, go to church, treat their girlfriends with more respect, and take responsibility for their lives in ways they never had before. Think about how threatening that must have been to people whose power depends on keeping young people angry, divided, and dependent. Here was someone showing an entire generation that they didn't have to accept the toxic messages they'd been fed about themselves, their country, and their potential. He was proving that with the right guidance and encouragement, young people who had been written off as lost causes could become thoughtful, responsible, contributing members of society. But it wasn't just what Charlie was saying that made him dangerous. It was how effectively he was saying it. He had developed through years of practice and refinement an almost unique ability to communicate conservative principles in ways that resonated with people who had never heard them presented positively before. He could take complex political and philosophical concepts and make them accessible, relevant, and inspiring to audiences that other conservative voices couldn't reach. This skill didn't develop overnight. Megyn reminded me that Charlie spent over a decade honing his craft, going from campus to campus, sometimes facing hostile crowds, learning from every interaction, getting better at connecting with people who started out disagreeing with him. By the end, he had become perhaps the most effective conservative voice for reaching young Americans, and the election results proved it. When someone can single-handedly shift youth voting patterns by nearly 10 percentage points, when they can inspire thousands of young people to fundamentally change how they live their lives, when they can prove that entire demographic groups that were considered permanently lost can actually be reached and convinced, that person becomes incredibly valuable to their allies and incredibly threatening to their opponents. Which brings us to the deeper question. What happens to society when inspiring voices are silenced? Megyn's prediction wasn't just about individual targets like herself or Charlie. It was about the broader trajectory of a society that increasingly resolves political disagreements through intimidation and violence rather than persuasion and democratic processes. She saw Charlie's assassination not as an isolated incident by a disturbed individual, but as a symptom of deeper breakdown in how we handle conflict and disagreement. Think about the progression we've witnessed over just the past few years. First, it was online harassment and attempts to get people fired from their jobs. Then, it was organized boycotts and pressure campaigns designed to make it financially impossible for dissenting voices to maintain platforms. Then, it was physical confrontations, attacks on people's homes, threats against family members. Charlie's murder represents the next escalation in this pattern. And Megyn's point was that it probably won't be the last. This trajectory is particularly troubling because it's not random violence or crime in the traditional sense. It's targeted elimination of specific voices that are effectively challenging approved narratives. The individuals being targeted aren't chosen because they're the most extreme or inflammatory. They're chosen because they're the most effective at reaching people who weren't previously receptive to their messages. Megyn described feeling like we're watching the country split into two incompatible groups with fundamentally different visions of what America should be. And increasingly neither side believes peaceful coexistence is possible. One side sees voices like Charlie's as existential threats that must be eliminated by any means necessary. The other side sees those elimination efforts as proof that democratic norms and constitutional protections are already dead. When both sides start operating from the assumption that the other side represents an existential threat. When both sides believe that normal political processes are insufficient to protect what they value most. When both sides begin to see violence as not just acceptable but necessary, that's when societies tear themselves apart. But even in her darkest prediction, Megyn left a glimmer of something else, a path forward. Interestingly, Megyn kept returning to one theme that surprised me with its hopefulness. Despite all the darkness she was predicting, despite her own personal fears about being targeted, she seemed convinced that there was still a way back from the brink. But it wasn't going to come through political processes or media strategies or even through brave individuals continuing to speak truth. It was going to come through something much more fundamental. The return of faith and genuine moral foundations to American life. Megyn argued that the root of our current crisis isn't really political at all. It's spiritual. She believes that when societies abandon the moral and spiritual frameworks that give life meaning and purpose, that void gets filled with destructive substitutes. In our case, politics itself has become a kind of religion for many people, complete with rigid orthodoxies, sacred texts that cannot be questioned, and heretics who must be purged. But political movements, no matter how passionately people believe in them, can never provide the kind of deep lasting meaning and moral guidance that actual religious faith provides. Political ideologies change. Political leaders disappoint. Political victories turn out to be temporary. When people try to find ultimate meaning and purpose in politics, they end up creating systems that are simultaneously fanatical and fragile. This insight helped me understand something I've been struggling with. Why are political disagreements becoming so intensely personal and so seemingly irreconcilable? Why do people seem willing to destroy relationships, abandon principles, and even resort to violence over political positions that in the grand scheme of human history are relatively minor differences of opinion about policy details? It's because for many people, these aren't just political positions anymore. There are religious beliefs in everything but name. And when someone challenges your religious beliefs, especially beliefs that you're using to provide meaning and purpose for your entire life, it doesn't feel like a policy disagreement. It feels like an attack on your soul. Megyn suggested that this is why traditional approaches to reducing political polarization haven't worked. You can't reason someone out of a religious commitment using political arguments. You can't fact-check someone's way out of a belief system that serves as their primary source of meaning and identity. You can't moderate someone's intensity when that intensity is filling a spiritual void that would otherwise make their life feel empty and pointless. But there is hope, and it lies in helping people rediscover genuine sources of meaning, purpose, and moral guidance. When people have strong families, genuine communities, and authentic faith traditions, they don't need politics to provide those things for them. They can engage in political discussions without feeling like their entire identity is at stake. They can disagree with someone without seeing that person as evil or subhuman. And if that's true, then the burden isn't just on Megyn or me. It's on all of us. Here's what I want you to understand. Everything we've been talking about, the targeting of voices like Charlie's and Megyn's, the breakdown of civil discourse, the escalation toward violence, the loss of shared moral foundations, none of it is happening in some distant political sphere that doesn't affect regular people living regular lives. These battles are being fought in your communities, your families, your daily conversations. Every time someone tries to shame you into staying quiet about something you know is true, that's part of the same pattern that eventually led to Charlie's assassination. Every time someone suggests that certain topics are too dangerous to discuss openly, that's how the boundaries of acceptable speech get narrowed until only approved voices are allowed to be heard. But here's the encouraging part. Every time you refuse to be intimidated, every time you speak up for what you know is right, every time you maintain relationships with people who are being systematically isolated, you're pushing back against that pattern. You don't need to be a media personality or a political figure to make a difference in this battle. You just need to be willing to be honest in your own sphere of influence. And for those of you who have lived through previous dark periods in American history, and many of you have something particularly valuable to offer right now. You remember what it was like when communities were stronger, when families were more stable, when people could disagree politically without questioning each other's basic humanity. You remember what we've lost, and that memory is crucial for helping younger people understand what we need to rebuild. You also have perspective on how quickly things can change, both for better and for worse. The people who are trying to silence voices like Charlie's and Megyn's want everyone to believe that their control is permanent, that resistance is futile, that the trends we're seeing now will continue indefinitely. But you know better. You've seen seemingly unstoppable movements collapse almost overnight when enough people decided they'd had enough. Your voices, your experiences, your refusal to be intimidated by people who are young enough to be your grandchildren. All of that matters more than you might realize. When you share your wisdom, when you tell your stories, when you remind people what kind of country we used to be and could be again, you're doing exactly the kind of work that Charlie was doing, just in a different context. And that brings us to the final lesson. What we do and how we respond matters now more than ever. Charlie Kirk will never see the full impact of the work he did. He'll never know how many young people he inspired to turn their lives around, how many minds he changed, how many future leaders he influenced. But that impact will continue long after his death, carried forward by everyone who was touched by his message and his example. The same will be true for Megyn Kelly. The courage she's showing right now, her refusal to be silenced even when she knows it puts her at risk. Her commitment to asking the questions that need to be asked, that's creating a model for others to follow. Every time someone sees her stand firm in the face of pressure, it makes it easier for them to find their own courage. And it's true for you, too. Every conversation you have where you refuse to be intimidated into silence, every relationship you maintain with someone who's being targeted for their beliefs, every small act of courage you perform in your daily life, all of it adds up. All of it matters. All of it contributes to preserving the kind of society where voices like Charlie's and Megyn's can exist and thrive. Courage really is contagious. When one person stands up, others notice. When one person refuses to be silenced, others find their voices. When one person pays the price for speaking truth, others realize that truth is worth defending, even when it's costly.